Welcome to TCN Talks. The goal of our podcast is to provide concise and relevant information for busy hospice and palliative care leaders and staff. We understand your busy schedules and believe that brevity signals respect. And now, here's our host, Chris Como.
Hello, and welcome to TCN Talks. This is always my favorite time of the month when Mark Cohen and I do the top news stories of the month. Welcome back, Mark. Always good to have you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for welcoming me back for another month of looking at big hospice news from August. It was quite a month.
It was quite a month. In fact, I was kind of reflecting this morning. It's been a big regulatory summer. Again, having you and I doing this for a couple of years now, you kind of get to see trends. But regulatory has definitely been a hot topic, not just for 1 month, but it seems like almost May into the summer. So you ready to jump in?
Absolutely. For our review of the top news of the month, both quantitatively and qualitatively, we're indebted, as always, Chris, to Cordt and Joy Berger at Hospice and Palliative Care Today, the essential daily read for anyone interested in the hospice sector. Subscriptions are free, and you can sign up on the website of Hospice and Palliative Care Today. And the biggest news from August, of course, was John Oliver's report on hospice fraud, abuse, and neglect on the HBO program Last Week Tonight, which had its first airing on Sunday night, August 18 at 11 p.m. Eastern. While Oliver, at several points, noted the good that hospice can do, the numerous cases of fraud, abuse, and neglect that he cited added up to a black eye for hospice. If there's any consolation for hospice leaders, it's that Last Week Tonight skews to a much younger demographic than the typical hospice decision maker. But in the long run, that's little consolation for us. As for the rest of the news, there was a total of 15 articles published in Hospice and Palliative Care Today that earned more than 1,000 clicks last month. I'll take a look at just a few of the more prominent ones. The big winner, as you were hinting in your comment about regulatory, the big winner from August 1 was the CMS fact sheet, quote, CMS 2025 Hospice Final Rule, Content and Initial Responses. It was one of the most widely read articles since Hospice and Palliative Care Today began publishing on January 1, with more than 3,000 clicks. The second most viewed article, with nearly 1,700 clicks, unfortunately, was an August 23 report in the trade publication Hospice News, headlined, Fraudulent Hospices Reportedly Target Homeless People, Methadone Patients to Pad Census. The sixth most viewed article, with 1,500 plus clicks, was a report in McKnight's with the headline, Home Health Sees Spending Utilization Decline as Hospice Equivalents Grow, MedPAC reports. And the 13th most viewed article, with 1,300 clicks, was a column by YoloCare's CEO Craig Dresang in the Davis, California Enterprise, headlined, YoloCare's Overregulated California Skips Key Regulations, which was a lament about needless overregulation in some areas and lax regulation when it comes to preventing the proliferation of fraudulent hospice operators in California. I've jumped around the top stories list this month so we could take some time to discuss John Oliver's blockbuster report, Chris. While Oliver didn't break any new ground, his recap of numerous instances of fraud, abuse, neglect, and deception over the past 15 or so years painted a devastating picture of the problems facing the hospice community. Oliver caveated his report in several places by noting the positives of good hospice care and that not every hospice provider succeeds on the back of fraudulent business practices. But the totality of the report was, as I said, devastating. One question that comes to mind, Chris, is does a report like this amplify the divisions between the growing for-profit sector in hospice and the slowly shrinking not-for-profit sector? Or does a report like this serve as an impetus for reputable providers from both the for-profit and the not-for-profit sector to join forces to protect the overall integrity of hospice and the hospice benefit? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I have a yes and a no thought. And I like actually the very end of your question. because absolutely we need to join forces to protect the integrity of what hospice has been and hopefully will continue to be, especially as the baby boomers are aging. The demographic, it's been called the silver tsunami. They need, want, and will desire high quality end of life care. So I think it's a yes and a no question. So first, yes, from the standpoint that generally, I think nonprofits, so yes, it is going to increase the divide. I think nonprofits are better set up, and you can push back on this, Mark, but I believe I've grown up on the nonprofit side, but original part of my career was in for-profit business before I came into healthcare. And so I think nonprofits are generally set up to do the right thing. It doesn't always hold true. Not every, just because you have the moniker of a nonprofit doesn't give you the automatically, but you have some things in your favor. You don't have to pay a shareholder. You don't have to pay private equity groups or investors, and you don't pay taxes. But that means you've got more resources to invest back into what is supposed to matter the most, which is the care by the bedside. Mark, I mentioned, you and I talked about the whole private equity thing last month, and in a couple weeks, we have a podcast coming out with the author of Ethically Challenged, the lady that did incredible research on the whole, how private equity is really the seedy side or dark side of private equity. And when I listen to it, I mean, there's elements of private equity that are good. If you bring capital to do good, and that's where I kind of landed the plane and where I want to land the plane on this one. I don't care what business you're in. If you're not about high service, high quality, and efficiency, you can say maybe the value, the cost of what you do, why are you in business? And you take this John Oliver episode, and unfortunately, he took some of the most egregious examples, and it kind of paints all of us in that light. Now, the no part where I think no, it should not increase the divide. I've always watched Carol Fisher, and because she's over MPHI, and so she always differentiates the business model between the for-profit and the nonprofit. But she is always quick to say the people by the bedside, the people you grew up with, Mark. I mean, when you were, in my kind of segment of your own career, you saw incredible people by the bedside, even though you worked for a very large, well-known for-profit. And I know many of your peers, I have great respect for you guys. You were all about making good care by the bedside. That's our common ground. So I think what maybe ticks me off, upsets me, is that the episode painted incredible workers throughout this country that are literally walking on sacred ground on a day-to-day basis, trying to provide great care. Some of those people that are in the tougher business models, they have an even bigger challenge of trying to do that on a day-to-day basis. But thousands and thousands and thousands of hospice workers, that's the part that's our common ground. Those people are all doing great work, and I'm sure it upset all of them. The other thing I was thinking, reflecting, and I knew you were going to ask this, the other thing that kind of upsets me, I looked up John Oliver's viewership, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000. And of course, he castigated Nurse Julie, who actually has millions of followers. I kind of wonder, the fact that you and I are talking about this, we're kind of feeding into the strategy from the get-go, which is, hey, let's pick a almost sacred topic, go very raunchy, take the most egregious examples, and we'll get a whole lot of people talking about it. And be darned if maybe that's not kind of part of the strategy.
Well, it certainly is. It's all about clicks. It's all about eyeballs. I think one of the struggles we have is that there's a fuzziness between the for-profit side and the not-for-profit side. A lot of for-profit providers have not-for-profit foundations that fund things like children's grief camps and final wishes, things like that. And there are not-for-profits that have entered into joint ventures with for-profits. And so the line between the two is nowhere near as clearly demarcated today as it was 20 years ago. And, that's confusing to people within the hospice field. Imagine how confusing it is to a consumer who knows little or nothing about the hospice field.
Yeah, and I think I shared this with you before, Mark. We've had some incredible, in fact, we even did a podcast with one of the best customer focus group people, I think, in our hospice field. And when you get those focus groups, they're like, what? For-profit, nonprofit? At the end of the day, the most important thing to them is quality of care. And that, to me, is what's so horrible about the John Oliver episode, taking these egregious examples and kind of painting in some respect the whole field in that light. Now, you may go, well, wait a minute, he did differentiate. But unfortunately, if you kind of watch, because unfortunately I watched it a couple of times, I'm afraid the general viewer, that's not what's going to stick in their brain. I'm afraid they would walk away and go, wow, is this what that whole, and unfortunately the word industry is used quite a bit. I'm sure you're going to talk about that in a second.
Well, related to what you just said, my second question for you, one of the things that I know frustrated a lot of hospice advocates about the Oliver report was that some of the abuses he cited were a decade or more old. People wondered, with some justification, ought there not be a statute of limitations on incidences of fraud and abuse? I know when I worked for Vitas in the early and mid 2000s, competitors would occasionally bring up a series of very negative articles that had run in a major metro daily 15 years earlier and frustrated us to no end. So, Chris, as the CEO, what was your reaction to Oliver's use of examples that were as aged as some of the cases he cited in his report?
Yeah, I think you alluded to a couple of minutes ago, Mark. Unfortunately, we live in the soundbite society and what gets clicks. And, you see this in all parts of our culture, right? I mean, look at the political thing. People, they go and try to dredge through people's past. I really do worry for our younger generation who all of their past now is cataloged always forever now on social media. And so, I was thinking about us talking about this show, and something came to me this morning. Think of a restaurant for a second. And so my wife and daughters and I and my sons were walking through Central Park visiting New York City many years ago. And that restaurant that's in the middle of Central Park, we're so hungry. So we get up to this restaurant and there are people dressed in rat costumes, and they had signs basically saying, don't eat at this restaurant. We're on strike and it has rats inside. Now, did that make me swear off restaurants the rest of my entire life? No, but it definitely made me swear off that restaurant for sure. But it's interesting that that whole experience stuck with me. Like, I do think about that from time to time. Because, you're talking about the guy was like 6 foot tall in a rat costume. So it was very sticky. You're getting my analogy, right? I feel like John Oliver took the raunchiest approach to take some very egregious examples and, dredge, stuff from the past. And unfortunately, I was also thinking from a business perspective, I can't help myself, this kind of my shtick. The feedback loop on a restaurant, like if you and I go to a bad restaurant, well, you and your wife walk away and you're like, yeah, that wasn't good. We're not going back. Unfortunately, in end of life care, because of the vulnerability of the people at the time, generally people not realizing that they have a choice, all of those things I think factor into that equation. And to me, that requires us to have a more sacred trust of the people that we serve. And as one thing I agree with John Oliver, Mark, there is a very deep, dark place of hell reserved for some of those people of those examples. He did the ratatouille about the one office, which I've heard Judy Lund-Person talk about. Well, hundreds of hospices licensed. That's not even a hospice. That's someone playing Monopoly. And I do think the deepest, darkest places of hell are reserved for kind of the people doing that. Another analogy, not the best one, is that's like comparing a lemonade stand to the Cheesecake Factory. But then I thought, that's not a good analogy because the kid in the lemonade stand still trying to do good. Those people are not even in the realm of trying to do good. So I'll get off my soapbox because I don't want to go in a rant about this.
Well, it's I think with the internet, hospice leaders have to realize that there is no half-life for a negative story out there anymore. And that means that you should always be prepared to talk about it. If you're a not-for-profit, your governing board needs to be able to talk about it. If you have a director, manager, or VP of communications, you hire a new one into that position, that person needs to be fully briefed on it. You can't hide it. One would hope actually that any credible candidate would find that in her or his research before applying for the job and would ask about it. But those things are here to stay. And on that subject, after John Oliver, ProPublica, the year-long Washington Post series that ran in the mid to late teens, and all of the local and national stories about individual cases of fraud, abuse, and neglect, some hospice leaders have got to be asking, Chris, how can we focus more on the good news and less on the bad news? I have some thoughts, but I'd love to hear your thoughts as a CEO.
Yeah, I really thought about you as what I was thinking about you asking me that question. And I think about your history and just your professionalism that you brought to marketing, mission moments, and then what we've identified as you and I've done this show is that those mission moments are not the same volume they were before because you don't have local print media, et cetera. So what I feel like, Mark, is yes, the challenge is probably higher now. There wasn't a ProPublica, there wasn't a John Oliver. I think some of the pioneers of our movement are like rolling over in their graves if they would have seen kind of the John Oliver. So to me, here's the thing. Then our challenge is more important now than ever to tell the beautiful stories. I've had the privilege and honor since early summer before I went on sabbatical. And since I've come back, this is kind of my busiest time. I travel a lot. I go out to our TCN members. So I get up and close and personal with the mission, Mark. We are a gold mine of beautiful stories. Gold mine. We have these stories. We need to be utilizing those stories instead of kind of getting down in the mud pit and slinging with the John Olivers and try to out raunchy them or out shout them. We have beautiful stories. I was thinking this morning, Mark, the most poignant experience in my life is a woman pulled me aside at one of our fundraisers when I was still the CEO of Four Seasons. And her mom had an amazing experience. She had gone through every part of our program. She had palliative care. She even had been part of our research. She ended up passing away in the inpatient unit, but she had home hospice care. And she literally, her punchline to me was, this whole experience will change the rest of the trajectory of my life because of just the healing that occurred between her and her mom and the reconciliation, things that unfortunately did not occur in other parts of her life. And I just remember sitting there with the weight of, that's what this is about. Doesn't happen every time. Pain, symptom management, all of the IDG team coming together, but we have that opportunity. And that's the high ground. And there's a lot of those stories happening every day. We've got to get better, more professional. The game has changed, as you've been pointing out, compared to what you grew up in. The game in terms of how do you get the story out? There's so many different channels, if you will. There's not just a few like newsprint and the local TV station. It's gotten more complex. And as you've also pointed out, the professional people in those departments are a little bit more scarce than they used to be. So that to me it says it ups the challenge. So I don't know what thoughts you have in addition to that.
Well, you've got to make an investment in telling your own story, and you've got to assume that your local media are only going to be so much help in telling your own story. And that means that a good hospice provider, whether not-for-profit or legitimate for-profit, needs to become its own broadcast entity and print entity on its website. You've got to cover your provider like a reporter would cover a beat. And one of the things that always shocks me is when I run into a communications manager who's been at a provider for 5 years, and that person has never, ever sat in on a team meeting, and because it doesn't have the time. But the only way you get those stories is if you build up trust with those folks at the bedside. They are never going to pick up the phone and call a corporate office and say, hey, we got this great story. You need to be out there reporting it. And you do that by touching the people at the bedside. Had a
Well
case
said.
at Vitas where the program that served largely the Black community in Chicago took on a patient, it's probably mid-2000s, who was a World War II combat veteran of the Tuskegee Airmen. And this gentleman was on service for about 3 months. And we get a call from the program when the patient is actively dying, asking us to arrange some media to come out and film him. And I said, no, I'm not going to, bring media out on the guy's last day of life. He should have called us 90 days ago when he was lucid and he could talk, and we could, tell his story. But the field people don't think that way. And you can't sit there and wait for the phone to ring. You've got to go out there and find the stories. And that takes time. And it's harder to do that today than it was 20 years ago. So I appreciate your candor on these questions, Chris. It's not in most CEOs' playbook to be that candid publicly on such a challenging issue. But there are times when leadership demands it. And I'd also like to point out with respect to John Oliver's report, Chris, that it validated one of my strongly held, if not lonely, beliefs. And that is that we should never, ever refer to hospice as an industry. Go back and watch the report and count how many times John Oliver refers to the, quote, hospice industry, unquote. It's frightening. He doesn't use any other term to refer to the hospice community, the hospice sector. Last week tonight has become Exhibit A in my mind as to the futility of hospice leaders, both for-profit and not-for-profit, talking about the hospice industry. Even one of the hospice advocacy groups that put out a statement in reaction to the Oliver report inexplicably used the phrase hospice industry. Just not smart. Now, aside from John Oliver and last week tonight, what did you see, Chris, from the C-suite in news coverage in August?
I'm going to go there in a second, but I just feel like I got to respond to what you just said. Like, obviously, Mark, you've been my mentor about that, about not using that word. I think the dime finally dropped. Besides the fact that I'm like, I have great honor and respect for you. So Mark says, don't you do it? I don't do it. I'll be in conversations with other people and we'll catch ourselves and like, Mark Cohen. But here's what hit me. I'm working on a very interesting project. We'll call it the Hospice Legacy Project with some amazing people. We're trying to gather some of the early wisdom and stories about how this thing came to be. That is why, like, I remember the HP commercial. Remember the HP commercial and the two guys that found it in the garage? They were trying to say this is something different being HP, but that was just one story. There are probably hundreds, Mark, and you know many of them, of the pioneers and founders that have created this thing that is hospice. To me, that's why it's not an industry. It's so different. Whatever segment of our economy that's that different. I mean, even the hospitals don't quite have the serendipitous, the providence, the synchronicity of how this thing came together and the benefit. It's other than, and of course, then the work that we do is other than. And I don't know, this whole thing, because how raunchy it was, it just hit me like, that's what Mark is alluding to. This is different. There is a rich history, and we're at an interesting crossroads for where does the whole sector, the field go as we go forward. So I just wanted to give you a shout out. I'm a slow learner, but the dime finally dropped. At least I listened to you, but now I kind of get it at a different level of what you're poking on. All right, so here's kind of my month. It's interesting now that for our listeners, please make sure you also look at when we push it. There's a link. We have a complete summary of what I'm about ready to go over, and there's some great data there. And the good thing is it's a summary. Joy and Cordt are doing incredible work at Hospice and Palliative Care today, as Mark said in the beginning of the show. They're flagging about 600 to 700 articles generally a month. Interestingly, my consistency is about 100 of those, somewhere between 90 and 100 each month. In the very beginning of our summary, you'll see the actual statistics of number of mission moments, number of reimbursement challenges. And this month, just the greatest category was the regulatory and political at about 18% of the actual articles. Interestingly, because there are about 100 a month, that means there are actually about 18 articles. And so, Mark, based upon viewer feedback, like, hey, I can read, dude. So that's great. Then they could just read the summary. I'm just going to hit about 30, so about a third of the 100 that I actually flagged, and I'm just going to hit kind of the high point. So in the mission moments, which is great, actually, there were about 6 articles this month that I flagged in total. I just cite one titled, this is Jelly Roll Stops Concert to Help Cancer Survivor Find a Better Seat. That was actually really cool. But the one I flagged was in Forbes, and I put it in the mission moment category, 9 powerful lessons on life that you can learn from experts on death. And these were a couple of the high points. People have goals besides living longer. The last day of your life is not the sum of your life. We're sexual beings throughout our whole life. The time to consult a palliative care physician is not when you're dying, but much earlier, well before. And no one should have to suffer. Those are just the top 5. Thought that was a great mission moment article. And then I just got to cite this one just because Joe Rotella is a great friend and just an amazing human being. Dr. Joe Rotella, The Importance of Being Human, Reflections of an Aspiring Medical Humanist. And that's a AHPM retrieve from the internet that Cordt and Joy retrieved. So that's again, 6 in the mission moment category. Next category is reimbursements, and there are about 9 in total. And so I think there are 2, because I have 2 subcategories under reimbursement. The first, general. Second is Medicare Advantage. This one is from Modern Healthcare. Cost report prompts tweaks to the ACO REACH model. And so there's some tweaks coming to ACO REACH. And unfortunately, they've saved some money, Mark. And when they save money, the government says, oh, we got to change the game a little bit. So some changes come to ACO REACH. Then under the subcategory of Medicare Advantage under reimbursement, there were 2 I flagged in this one. Inhabit walks away from United Healthcare after 9 months of unsuccessful negotiations. Thought that was an interesting strategy, Mark. They actually did a news release about, hey, we're walking away from the table because we can't reach a decision with United Healthcare. Interesting tactic. And then the other one I cited, which is kind of funny, I would do these 2. Optum's, which is the division of United Healthcare, why Optum thrives where other companies failed. But then you read the article, and obviously United Healthcare is huge. I think it's like up to $200 billion now. It basically cites the reason why they're successful is they own most of the pieces on the monopoly board. Just saying, there was a key word in what I just said. All right. Next category is competition. And so there are about 5 articles in that section. And so there's some really interesting, these big, huge, multi-billion-dollar organizations now in healthcare. But CVS launches $2 billion in cost cuts, and they also fired their CEO. Their Aetna president is actually out. And then, Mark, you've been good to kind of flag these for me. Of course, we see it because I live near Asheville, North Carolina. So HCA pushed out providers, downgraded care after acquiring Mission Health. And so this is a report in Healthcare Dive, and just a new working draft study from Wake University alleges that HCA has driven doctors away from Mission Hospital, and just goes on to catalog a lot of the negative impacts on healthcare in this amazing area where I call home. And then just one more in this section, just because many of us have been watching it with interest, is United Healthcare, as they've acquired many of the pieces on the board, Amedisys and LHC included. The United Healthcare and Amedisys have reached divestiture agreement in an effort to complete the merger. So as they've looked at it from an antitrust standpoint, they've had to divest themselves, which theoretically opens the door for that to actually move forward. It'll be interesting to see if that's where it ends up. My next category, which is a huge one, is workforce challenges. There were actually 11 articles in that category, and always break workforce into 3. Paints the picture, the implications of the challenges, and then the one I always love, which is the solutions to the workforce challenges. And those are just the ones that I cited this month was in the actual solutions. Here's one from McKnight's. You want more effective hospice nurses? Then overhaul your onboarding. And that's some great tips and tactics related to the onboarding process for nurses. A couple more I want to cite since I love solutions to the workforce challenge. Healthcare added 1 million workers since 2020. 5 things to know. 1, healthcare's employments have rebounded. Hospital and ambulatory has created a lot of job growth, but there's still persistent workforce challenges. Pandemic-driven employment shifts. So in other words, the pandemic has impacted. So moving care more from the acute care side to care in the home. And there's challenges in nursing and residential care. And that was in Becker's. And then this was an encouraging one. The age bias declines in the workplace, but there's still challenges remains. And why I put that in the solutions category, Mark, you're a perfect example. You're at a different stage of your life, but you're still working. Retirement could look different. We've got to be more welcoming for the baby boomers to keep their wisdom engaged in the workplace. And that could be part of the solution to some of our healthcare employment challenges as well. And then the last one under solutions, 15 employment engagement examples to inspire you in 2024. And this is from the Academy to Innovate HR. And they had some there's 15. I'm not going to cite them all, many of which we've talked about before: flexible work arrangements, employee recognition programs, a lot of investing in staff and training and their development, wellness programs, team building activities, credible culture. I could go on and on. A lot of those things I'm pretty passionate about. So that was actually the workforce challenges. The next category is one, usually I have a lot. This month it was 11, so 11%. Patient and family and the customer demographics and trends. In other words, major trends we need to be aware of that's impacting the future of the care that we're going to provide and the people we're going to be caring for, et cetera. So there's several. I cited in this one. The National Plan on Aging, essential to addressing key issues. This is an AARP, has issued a white paper. It's actually called a blueprint for developing a national plan on aging. There's some really cool pearls in that one, Mark. That's a tool I think I'm going to use in some strategic planning, et cetera. This was one, Mark, I thought about you because we've talked quite frequently about the pharmacy deserts, the healthcare deserts. I've never heard the term before. Cancer care deserts are spreading. And this was in actually Becker's about cancer treatment deserts are growing as more rural hospitals close and cut services. So a pretty big trend that we need to keep an eye on as we go forward. And let's see, I just had a couple more here. Healthcare systems brace for the silver tsunami. I've used that term quite a bit. This was a Becker's report and just talked about how the silver tsunami washing going shore of healthcare and just all the math problems that's going to create in terms of workforce, stretching. Do we have all the services available in the healthcare continuum that are going to be needed? All right, so that's usually a big category. The next is regulatory and political. And actually, this was my largest category this month with about 17 articles. I'm not going to cite, but just a few. The biggest one, Mark, you started off with, the wage index. In fact, we did a whole podcast with just two of my heroes, Annette Kaiser and Judy Lem-Person, where they unpack. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the wage index. So CMS rolled out the 2025 wage index. There are some tracks being laid that have major future year implications, like related to our patient family satisfaction survey called the CAPS. The HOPE tool, which is going to be, many of you are familiar with home health and OASIS. That is now the final track being laid on our version of OASIS, which is actually going to be called the HOPE tool. So, and as you pointed out, a whole lot of clicks on that as well. A lot of people having to dig into that, and hopefully you're paying attention because, again, it's going to change our world as we go forward. And then under regulatory, busted, the top fraud schemes of 2024. Unfortunately, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, hospice is number 9 at the top. And so national healthcare fraud, pharmacy, Medi-Cal fraud, telemarketer fraud, physical therapy, durable medical equipment, COVID testing fraud, genomic testing fraud, and unfortunately, there is fraudulent hospice claims. And so not a top that we actually want to be on. And obviously that gives then the John Olivers of the world some fuel to do what they did. Next one is Hospice Care Act would create reimbursement for high acuity hospice services. Of course, referring to Blumenauer, Congressman Blumenauer, what he put out earlier this summer. So that was in Hospice News. And then this one I kind of parked in this category, Mark, but it is a big deal. The NOC, what they're calling now the NOC NHPCO, so our National Organization Alliance is what they're calling it. And Steve Landers, who's a physician, was named the inaugural Chief Executive Officer, the CEO of the Alliance. So that was a pretty big announcement coming towards the tail end of August here. Next category is always a fun one, technology and innovations. And so I had 11 articles in this category. There's just a few I want to call out. This was interesting, Mark. Cleveland Clinic names its first chief AI officer. Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. I've even had some of my TCN members say, hey, Chris, what should we be doing in the AI realm? And so kind of shows in Cleveland Clinic is always a very, more advanced kind of tip of the spear of what they're trying to do. In that same spirit in technology, there's another one I cited from KFF, Kaiser Family Foundation, Rescue from Above, How Drones May Narrow Emergency Response Times. And it actually was in Clemens, North Carolina, and how they're using drones for certain 911 calls. Really interesting. And then this one, ALS stole his voice, but AI retrieved it. And just a almost kind of a mission moment story of how AI actually helped an ALS patient get their voice back. All right, so next, final categories. We're coming into the home stretch here. We call this one kind of the speed of change, resiliency, reculture. You could also call it leadership. And kudos to Joy and Cordt, because there used to never be any articles in this category. And now I'm actually finding several, and I couldn't help myself. So there's more than 2 on this one. But how the best leaders get unstuck. This is an actual McKinsey and Company article. And kind of the top 4 in that article was enhancing their learning agenda, taking an outsider's perspective, in other words, decentering yourself, collaboratively defining the S-curve. I can't go into all the detail on what that is, effectively how to redefine your business model and survive into the future. And I have a good friend, Meredith Elliott Powell, that talks quite a bit about this, future-proofing the organization. So that's a great way to get unstuck and get beyond that paralysis of analysis. And of course, Mark, you and I cited this quite a bit in last month, but this was a good leadership article in the CEO magazine, How Olympic Success Can Offer Leadership Lessons. And there were some great lessons in there. I'll just cite 3. Energy management, mindset, and teamwork were 3 cited. And then just one more in that section. Giving feedback can be daunting for new leaders. Here's how to provide it. And I see so many leaders struggle with this, having the courageous conversations. And I just thought that was an excellent article. And kudos to Joy and Cordt, because they did cite our leadership immersion course, which is November 4th through 8th. Shamelessly plugging it because it is an amazing resource. Please make sure you check it out. We'll make sure we'll put it a link in our show notes. And that's it in that section. So coming into the home stretch, Mark, next we call this one just the human factor. And this is a really interesting ethical one. I'm sure Joy's the one who cited this one. Leaving your legacy via death bots. An ethicist shares their concerns, and this was in Medscape. And just this whole fascinating, important development in AI, which just raises many questions about using death bots. And so there's just a lot of ethical quandaries related to this. Just the Joy's publisher notes, the article includes several thoughtful ethical questions regarding the use of AI via death bots. All right. And then the very last category is kind of Chris's category, Mark. Just a few things that actually I had quite a bit this month. I had 13 that I actually cited, but I only will point out a few. One, I just want to give a shout out. Is Teleask Clinically Integrated Network sets benchmark for healthcare excellence. And to me, that's so antithetical to the few examples in the Oliver podcast. But just talking about how our Clinically Integrated Network is working on high quality of care. What happens by the bedside and how it elevates all the way to the CIN, and how we're putting that together to create a value proposition to people that are going to care in the future. What drives healthcare spending? This was a KFF article. What drives healthcare spending in the U.S. compared to other countries? And then kind of dismissed the fact that it's related to prescription drugs. I said, yeah, that's a part of it. But then it's interesting. It said a lot about physician spending, which maybe what it's poking on there is the fee-for-service aspect. But it said the U.S. also spends more in administrative costs and a lot less of long-term care. And I think I mentioned to you, Mark, when I was on sabbatical this summer, one of my research projects was to go back and reread T.R. Reid's book about the healing of America. And he went and studied healthcare systems all over the world. It's an incredible book. And it's interesting, he had the same conclusion of the book, is that the administrative, kind of this weird patch quilt that we are in the United States, how much that of our healthcare dollar that eats up, which is not care. You think of any business, if you have this huge overhead burden and not in the actual business of what's in the business to do, that would be a problem. And I have a feeling many years from now, we're going to be talking about that on this show, because at some point we have to fix that issue of the weird patch quilt that we are, and how much stuff that occurs that's not actually related to healthcare and the resources it eats up. And then this one, you and I spent a lot of time last month on the general concept, but Steward laid off more than 1,200 Massachusetts hospital workers. And just the private equity involvement in that whole circumstance was not good, and actually really screwed up some really good healthcare. Few more. New England Hospital CEO warns lawmakers of a crisis, Mark, in the rural healthcare system. And so Maine Health CEO was one of 3 who recently told federal lawmakers that rural healthcare systems are in a crisis. And you've been one who has constantly called that out. And then just last one, very last one. This is something we're pretty passionate about at TCN. Beyond a project management office, why transformation offices are the future. And just talking about very few transformations deliver on their goals. And we've used a competency of project management, but I think we're also kind of in the business of helping organizations go from good to great. So that way it actually does reflect by the bedside with high quality of care. And this was in human resources executive, and I just want to put that in my section. So that's it, Mark. About 30 articles I wanted to call out. And so why don't we close with your masterclass? Anything you want to say of anything I cited?
No, I think you said it all. We'll get into the masterclass. And with a reluctant tip of the hat to John Oliver this month, Chris, our masterclass in hospice marketing and communications will be a quick review of some of the basics of crisis communications. The Last Week Tonight segment, of course, was not the kind of crisis communication story that involves a single provider alleged to have done something egregious, from a loved one alleging inadequate care to a whistleblower claiming fraud and abuse. But it does serve as a reminder to all hospices that a public crisis situation is just one media phone call away. And even if you're a hospice that does not proactively work to earn media coverage, and actually, particularly if your hospice does not actively work with your local media, it's important to be prepared for a crisis communication scenario. Responding appropriately to a crisis is not something you can learn in 5 minutes. But here's a recap of a handful of basics to give listeners a foundation upon which to build. First things first, know who your spokespeople are, and that's spokespeople plural. In an ideal situation, you want a first-level spokesperson, such as your head of PR and marketing. Then you need a clinical spokesperson, a nurse or physician, or even a social worker or chaplain. Then you need a high-level spokesperson, likely your CEO. And if you're a not-for-profit, you ought to have a member of your governing board identified and prepped to serve as a spokesperson as well. One reason for having a first level and then a higher level spokesperson is that you don't want to put the public face of your organization, your CEO, on the front lines of every crisis. As I've said before in our podcast, Chris, I apply a textbook definition of economics, the allocation of scarce resources amongst competing choices, to define healthcare public relations and healthcare leadership. And in all of healthcare, not just hospice, the scarcest resource is the political capital, the credibility of the CEO, the face of the organization. Putting the CEO out there to respond to every negative story risks burning that scarce capital. Keep the CEO in reserve for when the credibility of the organization is definitively on the line. The CEO, for example, shouldn't be the first responder when one aggrieved family member finds a sympathetic reporter to complain to about perceived service failures. Once you've identified your spokespeople, train them, not just once, but with regular refreshers. Large healthcare organizations have crisis communications agencies on retainer to perform that training. A hospice organization on a limited budget could employ a train-the-trainer model and spend a couple $1,000s to send the head of communications to a public relations seminar on crisis communications, and then bring what she or he learned back to the organization to train the clinical spokesperson, the CEO, and others. If that's more than the budget will stand, then you can at least do a Google search for crisis communications tips and put together a reasonable program outline. If you have a large employer in your community with a credible public relations operation, you can ask them if they would do a pro bono training for your designated spokespeople. A third tip is to know your message points. How do you bridge smoothly from a reporter's gotcha question to talking about what you want to talk about? Things like quality, access, staff expertise, mission, and the like. That naturally leads to a fourth point. As I've stated several times on our podcast, Chris, no comment is never the right response. Yes, it's what most cautious legal counsel will strenuously advise because they are more concerned with winning in the court of law, but not in the court of public opinion. And when a healthcare organization no comments a serious allegation, you can just hang a guilty sign around your neck. You've lost, and you'll never recover the lost credibility with regards to this specific allegation. There are lots of ways to say no comment without saying the words no comment. I've outlined them in previous podcasts with you and even in presentations to the NHPCO's annual leadership conference. A fifth tip is a long-term recommendation. Tell your story. repeatedly and over time, over and through all available media. It shouldn't be a one-off in the run-up to your biggest fundraising event of the year. You need to look for what you, Chris, call mission moments and get them out to the public year-round. Do that, and you'll build up the reputational goodwill that will see you through most crises. Finally, if you're a large enough organization, have a pro standing by to provide advice and counsel, and maybe even serve as the spokesperson who has to fall on a sword for the sake of the organization. Having a pre-established relationship with the local public relations agency so that when a crisis strikes, they are ready to step in and provide assistance is just good common sense management. That means committing the time and money each year to ensure the agency knows you, your mission, what differentiates you, how the Medicare hospice benefit works, who your best spokespeople are, what your in-house capabilities are, and the like. A small investment every year will save an organization a huge amount should it have to bring in professional help cold after a crisis hits. There's a Murphy's Law that generally applies here, Chris. The more a healthcare provider preps for a media crisis, the less likely it will be slammed with a media crisis. And the more a healthcare provider cheaps out on prepping for a media crisis communications situation, the more likely it will get slammed with a media crisis communications situation. That's our masterclass for this month, Chris. As always, I'm happy to network with listeners who have questions and comments about hospice marketing and communications. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. That's just brilliant, man. That's solid gold. And I love your Murphy's Law that you kind of ended on. It's interesting. We had John Macbeth on our Anatomy of Leadership podcast. He actually had an amazing organization called Next Century Corporation. And I actually got to shadow his leadership team. He brought in one of the top professors from the Army War College. And what he said is what you just said, like how they actually, why they prepare at the level they prepare. And so that is a true master class in pure gold where you landed the plane. To our listeners, we really do thank you. And I just want to encourage you, subscribe, hit the follow button, pay this forward. Mark and I do this every month in service to you. We realize your jobs are incredibly hard, whether you're a leader by the bedside, and we want you to have the greatest intel, insight, what's here, what's coming, so that way you can be better prepared to do this great work that we do. And as we always do, we always end in a quote. Mark picked one, and I picked one. Actually, our good friend Judy Lund Person emailed me last night and said, I'm going to use that one. So let me use Mark's first. It's from Benjamin Franklin. By failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail, which is exactly on point to his master class. And this one that I'll end with from David Bowie, which to me kind of goes through a lot of the other articles, and unfortunately the one that we have to cite from the HBO series. But aging is an extraordinary process whereby you become the person that you always should have been. Thanks for listening to TCN Talks.
Thank you to our TCN Talks sponsor, Delta Care RX. Delta Care RX is also the title sponsor for our April and November 2024 Leadership Immersion courses. Delta Care RX is primarily known as a national hospice, PBM, and prescription mail order company. Delta Care RX is a premier vendor of TCN and provides not only pharmaceutical care, but also niche software innovations that save their customers time, stress, and money. Thank you, Delta Care RX, for all the great work you do in the end-of-life and serious illness care.